plastics.
Montreal, the city that I've lived in for the past 4 years or so, is a city that gets a lot of snow. And when I say a lot of snow, I don't mean the kind of place where you go there and there's snow often. I mean there's physically a ton of snow. It builds up over the course of the season, and if you were to let it accumulate, by spring you'd probably end up with 10 plus feet of snow lining the sides of the roads. The thing is, that never happens because anytime there's a bit of a snowstorm, the city sends a squad of over 1,000 vehicles to scoop up all the snow and to dump it into a pit at the top of the city. This is called déneigement, or snow removal in English, and pardon my French, I know it's terrible. There's obviously a ton of reasons they want to do this, the most obvious of which is that as the snow starts to pile up, it gets harder and harder to use the streets for their intended purpose. When it snows and the snow doesn't get cleared for a couple days, the areas that used to accommodate 3 or 4 parked cars end up only being able to accommodate 1 or 2, thanks to the piling up of snow creating massive banks that make it almost impossible to park in an efficient manner. And of course, the snow is also a hazard. It can be dangerous for able-bodied people, much less those using mobility devices, or who are older and prone to slipping on ice that forms when snow melts and refreezes over and over again. The city of Montreal is extremely well prepared for snow, and it's not just because they have to be. It's baked into the culture here. Montreal is the 3rd oldest city in North America, behind only Mexico City and Quebec City, which means that the people hanging out here have had plenty of time to figure out what to do when it's 30 below. Ice hockey was invented here. Canada's first ever electrified building was Victoria Skating Rink in downtown Montreal, which hosted the first ever indoor game of ice hockey in March of 1875. Sorels, those boots that for a long time were the de facto boots that anyone wore when the weather was cold and wet, are named after a city here in Quebec called Sorel-Tracy. So it's no surprise that when it comes to keeping a city running in the snow, Montreal has always been ahead of the curve. In most cities that get any amount of snow in North America, like Boston or New York or Portland, for example, when it snows, it is the property owner's responsibility to keep the sidewalks in front of their house or business clear of snow, and the property owner is held liable if someone gets hurt as a result of them failing to do so. But in Montreal, things work differently. Here they recognize that having to constantly have some next-door kid on speed dial so that you can get your sidewalks cleared when you're in a different province and a foot of snow decides to show up out of nowhere can be a bit of a burden, and one that's not always exacted on the sort of people who are best prepared to handle it. And so instead of adopting that model, Montreal chooses to use a bunch of Japanese miniature snowplows to cruise down the sidewalks at about 25 miles per hour and clear them just about instantly anytime there's even the slightest snowfall. And walking about Montreal in winter is therefore incredibly easy. Far easier than you would expect given how impossible the weather conditions can be and how hard it is to do in most comparable places. They've essentially bubble wrapped the entire city to make it totally immune to ill or inclement weather, to the extent that, unlike places like Los Angeles, where I grew up, and where the moment it rains, the news is talking about people, quote, bracing themselves for impact, end quote. And I'm not kidding, this was a Los Angeles Times headline I actually saw when I was there over the recent holidays. Unlike Los Angeles, where somehow after 5 minutes of rain, the highway becomes an absolute wasteland of spun-out cars and people are soaked to the bone and walking around in soggy tennis shoes. Unlike that, in Montreal, it could snow 3 feet, and you may not even notice it was happening. Literally as I write this, my weather app is showing a warning for Vancouver, which is where my wife's family lives, indicating that there is a serious risk of frostbite and or death thanks to the cold snap bringing in temperatures as low as, wait for it, minus 12 degrees Celsius, which is hilariously the exact temperature that it is here in Montreal right now, and I haven't seen a peep about it. The Quebecois are prepared. I am also, as I write this, walking along a pedestrian path that runs beside the Lachine Canal, which is a 20-mile-long canal that used to serve the city's factories as they shipped commodities in and out of the city, and which, like so many other pieces of our urban industrial heritage, was converted into a picturesque walking path and something of a tourist attraction after the city's industry declined and the number of fires along the abandoned canal started to become unpleasant. There are 2 paths, one on each side of the canal, but it is only the path on the western side of the canal that gets salted and plowed and kept free of snow so that it can continue to be used all winter long. It's the western side of the path that I'm on as I write this, but I had to, for a brief moment, traverse the eastern side of the path in order to get to it. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that if the western side were in the same condition as the eastern side, that I would not be out enjoying a nice walk on this beautiful sunny day with my daughter in front of me in her stroller, because as it turns out, it is incredibly difficult to write even by voice transcription, which is the method I've discovered works nicely for me in these situations, while also navigating my way through a veritable tundra landscape, which constantly threatens to, if not tip the whole stroller over, to at least sufficiently bounce the stroller enough to wake my daughter up and end this writing session. If anything, that makes me among the clearest beneficiaries of the city's snow removal system. And yet, despite all of that, a big part of me wants it all to just go away. I remember very clearly the first time I ever saw a snow removal operation. It is something to behold. You can't really grasp how massive it is until you've seen it. Basically, here's what happens. 24 hours before they start, one side of the street gets decorated with a bunch of red no parking signs, and everyone rushes out to find a place to move their car. This sounds similar to what happens on street sweeping days in most cities, but it's actually far more traumatic because, unlike street sweeping, where if you fail to move your car, the meter maid might not actually come around, and even if they do, the worst that's going to happen is you're going to get a $50 or $60 ticket. With snow removal, failing to move your car means that you hold up the entire operation, and all the heavy equipment sometimes can't get through. And in that case, you're pretty much guaranteed to have your car towed. So people take it seriously. Inevitably, there's a few stragglers, so to catch those people, and to avoid having to tow the cars, a few hours before the operation starts, the city sends out a parade of vehicles with sirens to drive around the blocks that still have straggling parked cars again and again and again, until the people responsible for them either run out of their homes in their pajamas, out of breath and incredibly relieved to find that their car is still there, or the tow truck arrives. This process usually takes about an hour, and because the snow removal windows are from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., that means that the sirens typically start at highly inconvenient hours, often in the middle of the night or early morning. Once the operation actually begins, the first people to show up are the bulldozers, who make a series of passes up and down the streets in order to take the accumulated snow and turn it into one single uniform snowbank. And each time they reach the end of a push, they have to lift the gigantic blade of steel off the ground, turn the hefty machine around, and drop the thing back down again. And the blades are so absolutely massive that on more than one occasion, the thud that it makes when it collides with the pavement has woken me up in the middle of a deep sleep. I think the California side of my brain codes it as an earthquake. Imagine just how hard an object needs to smack a sheet of asphalt in order to be able to feel it from all the way inside your house. That's how massive these things are. Then, once the dozer is done, a parade of diesel engines shows up, and if by now you hadn't already been awakened in the night, you are officially awake because what happens is the first truck in the line, which is outfitted with a snowblower, slowly and steadily combs over the line of snow that has been set up by the bulldozer, blowing it out the top of the pipe and into the back of a gigantic dump truck that creeps alongside it. It's a dance that's perfectly coordinated so that just as soon as the dump truck at the front of the line is reaching capacity, the one behind it swoops in so that right as the lead pulls away, the next in line takes over collecting the snow without any sort of a pause in the operation. Altogether, there's probably about 10 trucks, more or less, in any individual lineup, and when they peel off, they truck about 10 tons of snow up to the top of the city, where there's an old stone quarry, so full of snow that it does not melt all year round, which they then dump it into. And then like taxi cabs at the airport, they return to the city, get back in the lineup, and do it all over again, until every last bit of snow has been removed from the streets of the city. This process takes about 3 days and requires over 1,000 vehicles in order to operate. It is mesmerizing. It is awe-inspiring. There's a feeling of sheer power to it all, of triumph against the elements, and of man's absolute dominance over anything that nature could possibly throw at him. You gave us 10,000 tons of snow? Yeah, well, we scraped all that winter up off the ground and threw it straight in the garbage. At a distance, this all sounds like an obvious win for the people of this city. But I have to admit, the very first time I witnessed this grand operation, despite the spectacle, I was hit with a pang of anxiety. It was hard to ignore the sight of the black exhaust streaming out of the tailpipes of the machines, and then thinking about the amount of energy it must take to lift a single one of those dozer blades off the ground, not just once, but repeatedly, up and down and up and down, and not just lifting them, but using them to push thousands of tons of snow. And again, think about how hard it is to move just one shovel's worth of snow a couple of feet, much less hundreds of cubic feet push down an entire street. And imagine this happening. Oh, wow. I got to pause for a second because this is happening outside my window in the basement right now. Okay, we're back. So imagine this happening over the entire fleet of 1,000 vehicles and for 72 straight hours. And the panic-inducing amount of diesel we have to burn in order to provide the energy to make all that work for one single snow removal operation. The only thing I could think when I saw it was, is this really worth it? Do we really need to be doing all this? That was an inception moment for me. It planted the seed of doubt that, over the course of the time I've lived here, has grown significantly. I know it's going to sound crazy to a lot of people, but a big part of the reason I wanted to move to Montreal in the first place was the weather. I love snow. Some of my favorite childhood memories happened up in the mountains, whether it was skiing with my dad in California, or visiting my mom's side of the family at Christmas in Wisconsin and building snowmen with my grandpa. When I think back to my early childhood, at least half of the best memories that come back happened in cold weather places. But as someone who grew up in California, that cold weather was elusive. We got it when we drove up to the Sierras to go skiing, assuming it was a decent year for snow. But even then, it always seemed to feel like we were chasing something that was avoiding us. We would drive up to the local mountains for a short trip and pray that when we arrived at the mountain that it would at least be cold enough that the snow wouldn't be actively melting and running off of the hill, and that our skis wouldn't stick to the wet snow. And it always seemed to feel like the good weather we were hoping for was just barely beyond our grasp. I don't know how much of this was just the reality of chasing snow in California, but based on the way the previous generations talk about it, and based on the infrastructure they left behind, the fact that there are resorts in the Los Angeles mountains that, without snowmaking capabilities, have not even opened for many years, I've always had the sense that my California was not the same California that it used to be, and that it was climate change that was pushing the snow farther and farther away from my reach. Climate change has been looming over me since I was a kid. I remember going mountain biking once with my dad when I was very young on a trail that crossed a creek, and I thought it was just so cool because you had to ride your bike through the creek in order to get to the other side. We returned to do that same ride many times afterward, but every subsequent time the creek was dry. I would ask my dad when the water was going to come back, and he would say stuff like, "If it hasn't come back already, it might never." That scenario seems to have followed me throughout my life. We took a rafting trip once, and my older brother told me that at some point during the rafting trip there was going to be a bridge, and that we could jump off the bridge into the river. But when we got there, we found out that the water level was so low that what had previously been a 15-foot drop was now a 35-foot drop and was far too risky for us to jump. By the time I was just a little bit older, I came to understand that this was a problem that wasn't likely to go away in my lifetime. And that meant that if I wanted to enjoy the types of activities that I love so much and not worry about them teetering on the brink of extinction, I probably needed to live somewhere where the climate was not itself hovering on the brink. I moved to New York in 2017. Not entirely for weather-related reasons, but I was certainly excited about the weather, and the fact that instead of having to chase after things like snow and water, there would actually just be a whole season in which those things came to me. But even in New York, the winters I spent there were some of the warmest on record, with the least amount of snow on record, and with the fewest snow days on record, and I felt disappointed that even my cross-country move had not pushed me far enough into a weather buffer for me to be able to just relax and enjoy winter for what it was, or what it was supposed to be. As I mentioned before, New York is one of those places where the landlords are responsible for shoveling the snow when it does happen, and I can remember one particularly absurd situation where we did get an inch or two of snow, and my landlord called me because, go figure, his guy wasn't available, and he wanted to know if he could pay me $20 to shovel the snow. And I liked the guy, so I said of course I'd do it, and that he didn't need to pay me the $20. But I couldn't help but feel the absurdity of the situation because even as I was shoveling, the snow was already starting to melt, and it was just so painfully obvious that there wouldn't be any left, even within a couple of hours. Incidentally, the snow was gone in a couple of hours, and it didn't snow again for the remainder of the year. This is all a roundabout way of saying that when I got the opportunity to move yet again, this time to Montreal, which is a place that is not just known for being cold, but for being absolutely frigid, to the degree that some people find it terrifying, I was excited about the possibility that I might finally live in a place where I didn't need to worry about whether winter was going to occur. Part of that fantasy was nurtured by the brand that the city exports. I remember I watched The Parts Unknown, which was Anthony Bourdain's show, about Quebec and Montreal, where Tony teams up with David McMillan and Fred Morin from Joe Beef for a winter jaunt around a city that is practically sparkling in the snow. The public outdoor ice skating rinks, the fogged up windows of cozy restaurants packed with an evening crowd, and most importantly, the snow. The snow everywhere. It's a romantic picture. The term winter wonderland does not even do it justice. All these years I've been chasing the snow, and it would finally be mine. I wouldn't need to worry about whether there would be snow on the mountains to ski in the winter, whether or not the ponds would freeze over well enough to skate them, and whether or not the kids in my neighborhood would build giant snowmen on the streets on their days off from school. It would all just happen, and to a certain degree, it does. But at the same time, it's hard not to view the city's approach to controlling the weather as something that is in direct opposition to the joys that nature is attempting to give us, and which are so rapidly disappearing. As I mentioned before, I know that I'm among the most obvious beneficiaries of the city's handling of snow. And yet somehow, anytime we get a good storm, instead of me sitting around anxiously awaiting the arrival of the machines to come scoop up the snow so that I can get on with my business, I find myself rooting for the snow itself. I feel that I want it to accumulate, and to pile up, and to become unmanageable. I want it to disrupt business as usual. I feel excited imagining just how high the snow level might rise. It's not the rational part of my brain doing all this, it's the emotional part, the childlike one. The one that knows that the more it snows, the bigger the sled hill is going to get. This part of my brain knows that at best, the snow removal trucks coming around means that everything I might have had planned for the day can carry on as expected. But that if the snow removal squad never came, and the snow just kept piling up to infinity, that the world that I would be greeted by upon stepping outside would be brand new, totally unpredictable, and almost magical. That world would be full of energy, laughter, the excitement of children seeing mounds of snow twice as tall as they are, and adults chatting about how the experience compares to the ones they might have experienced in their youth. It would be a cultural event that connects those of the past to those of the present. And yes, it would pose some challenges, but they're the temporary sort of challenges that usually result in collaboration rather than conflict. The type of collaboration that brings people closer together instead of driving them apart. When the world is predictable and divided up into little bits of ownership and responsibility, it makes it easy to make judgment calls about what's fair and about who is and isn't pulling their weight, and who is responsible for what, and who's getting more done than others, and who's getting more than they deserve. But when the world is totally unpredictable, as it is under a thick blanket of snow, people tend to behave selflessly, because it's much easier to be selfless when you know that what you're dealing with is unique and temporary. Here we're not developing rules and protocols for a steady and predictable version of life. We're adapting to a hand that was dealt to us at random, which we are unlikely to ever be dealt again in the exact same way. These are the sorts of challenges that bring us together and bring communities together instead of driving us apart, and that underlie the sense of wonder that is so common in childhood but is strikingly absent from the adult world. We often say that no one on their deathbed has ever expressed their regret that they didn't spend enough time at work, which is to say that it's not the process of earning money that creates the memorable moments that one reflects on later in life. Though there are certainly exceptions, work for many people is simply the process of continuing to exist. Work does not add any of what I like to call anchors to experience, which we can use to form a strong point of reference in our mind when we look back on them. The function of the snow removal system is the same in that it simply accommodates our continued, uninterrupted existence and smooths over any unexpected variety from which we might have formed a memory of that time. A memory which, if it were shared amongst enough people who were there to experience it, might even become a cultural event. If you visit the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and step into the Canadian wing, you'll find more than a few romantic paintings from previous centuries in Quebec, depicting scenes that showed just how much of a focal point snow was in the formation of culture in this province. There's no shortage of paintings capturing the power that snow has to alter familiar landscapes in remarkable ways. There are paintings of livestock being used to keep streets clear of snow by pushing it all to the sides, forming what ends up looking like a half-pipe of snow running down the middle of some of the major streets. And there are photos as well. I remember seeing one in particular which was taken in the neighborhood of McGill University, where the snow is piled so high that a channel has had to have been dug just to provide access to the floors on the lower levels of the building. Do the people in these photos look angry or perturbed at the amount of snow they've had to shovel, or for the extreme inconvenience they've suffered thanks to the weather? On the contrary, They all have big fat smiles on their faces, as if to say, look at this incredible thing that's happened. Is it not amazing? What does it mean that this incredible natural phenomenon that once inspired artists to create the objects that now form our cultural heritage is now simply considered a nuisance to be taken care of? And even more so, what does it mean that we behave this way in the world of today, which has fewer and fewer opportunities to experience nature as it was intended? And by that I mean a truly unstructured world, one that has not been flattened and defractalized in order to accommodate the infrastructure of societal efficiency. Snow provides the closest thing to a hard reset of the landscape that we're ever likely to get. A single good snow more or less erases the entire landscape. It deletes the asphalt and the concrete and the grid system. It buries our signage and our parking lots and our steel and concrete infrastructure, and it dampens the sound, especially in an urban area where generators and engines and airplanes are the typical soundscape. And when you walk outside during a good snow and experience the silent white landscape, especially if you do it at night, you get a hint of an older, more timeless type of life in this world. The fact that it has been demonstrated that merely looking at fractals offers enough benefits to humans to do things like improve their test-taking ability and lower their feelings of anxiety is a reason for me to believe that the defractalization of our landscape is hurting us, and that the world that we've created to be efficient might not be the world we're best suited to live in. And while it certainly sounds nice to be able to walk out our front doors and stroll effortlessly down the sidewalk, regardless of the amount of snow that's accumulated over the winter, there may in fact be something much more fundamental to our well-being, which is not what we want, but what we need. After all, is it not pursuing what we want that has led us to this time of skyrocketing unhappiness and dissatisfaction and environmental destruction? As could probably be expected, the times I've made this point publicly have typically resulted in reactions ranging from funny looks to outrage. Some claim snow removal is as essential as any other city service, like trash pickup or water treatment. But it's not the same. Those services exist to rectify the consequences of problems we ourselves created in the pursuit of our other wants. Trash exists because we want cheap and convenient packaging for things we'd rather buy than make. And water treatment because our waters are polluted and not safe for drinking. And so when we implement these services, we are correcting the byproducts of our own actions and restoring our environment to a healthier state. But in the case of snow removal, we are expending energy in order to modify the world away from its natural state. In today's era of climate change, doubling down on energy-intensive artificial modification of our environment as a dependency for society's basic functioning seems not just unwise, but entitled, even arrogant. Since according to my rough calculation, one snow removal operation is equivalent to driving in a passenger car back and forth across the North American continent 8,500 times. Other comments I've received speak to the idea that any change to the snow removal operation would disproportionately affect some groups over others. But this way of thinking is misguided, and for several reasons. First of all, because it assumes that it is not only possible, but desirable to create a uniform human experience when it is precisely the lack of uniformity, our different ways of engaging with the world as a result of who we are, that provides the entropy necessary to live a fulfilling life. A world of uniform experience would look a lot like the one represented in movies when a husband and wife sit down at the dinner table with nothing to talk about after 50 years. Second, this way of thinking is binary when it should be relative. It naively assumes that if we don't do it the way that we do it now, then the only alternative is that we stop doing anything at all and leave a portion of the population stranded in a snowbank. Here in particular, I tend to question whether this is really a good faith argument or just a weaponization of the oppressor-oppressed dynamic in defense of the status quo. And finally, I believe this way of thinking disregards the fact that everyone, not just the able-bodied majority, is affected by their environment. It's not as if the fact that a man in a wheelchair counts on snow removal to make his trips about town easier means that he is therefore any less affected by the black smoke coming out of a tractor's tailpipe. So, what am I calling for here? Am I suggesting that we simply abandon the entire concept of removing snow and all the benefits that it has? Am I suggesting that there's no place for convenient transport? Am I suggesting that access for people with limited mobility is a concern that should go out the window? Am I suggesting that all innovation and systems that we've developed over the last century, not just in Montreal with respect to snow, but in any place we've added convenience and efficiency to the functioning of human society, are for nothing? Of course not. There's nothing wrong with finding solutions to problems. But the access we have to cheap energy has made us lazy and dulled our ability to create elegant solutions that invigorate our culture in favor of brute force solutions that leech it. In this sense, it's similar to what happened in the world of software, where when processing speed went up, it removed the incentive to write efficient code and caused the overall quality of the code to go down. This is a topic I plan to cover more deeply in subsequent episodes. If for some reason we suddenly lost access to that cheap energy, and it became impossible to continue to remove snow the way we do today, it seems highly unlikely to me that the whole city would just pack up and leave. After all, European people have been living here since the 16th century, long before combustion engines made large-scale snow removal possible. For me, the answer lies in questioning the wisdom in allowing ourselves to remake the world in accordance with the way that we imagine it will be most convenient for us. I think that the more we are open to the possibility that altering our environment confers both benefits and harms, and that it is unlikely that any benefits can come without side effects, and that we may not be aware of those side effects until they've taken something from us that we can't get back, the more we will act thoughtfully and conservatively, and the more we may stop to consider, at various points along the way, the things that are meaningful to us. Thanks for listening. See you next time.